How many of you are familiar with Star Wars? Basically everyone in the room? Okay, yeah, solid. So I'm assuming since you know about Star Wars, you've heard about the Death Star, which is a giant piece of metal the size of the moon. It's basically a space station, and it can destroy a planet with one strike. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, a group of students in Pennsylvania figured that it would cost $8.1 quadrillion for the steel alone that it would cost for the Death Star if we were to maybe construct this. Well, $8.1 quadrillion, for those of you who maybe don't really know how much money that is, that's 13,000 times the entire world's GDP. So not only would the steel bankrupt the entire world, there would be even more money that we would owe if we were to try to construct the Death Star. So while I'm not out here trying to build the Death Star or anything like that while studying aerospace, I believe that we as ISM students strive for success, and maybe we can create something great or as iconic as the Death Star, but maybe with a more positive impact. So I know for me, in my independent studies, sometimes I run into the problem of explaining why I am interested in this topic. So for me, yeah, I've always loved aerospace. I love space, I love math, science, I like building things. But to some people, they question why I like math. Like, why do you spend your time wanting to study calculus or take another physics class? Well, I've put together kind of an inspiration board, kind of from the roots of how I got interested in aerospace engineering. So as you can see, Star Wars, the Death Star, those are just some cultural things that I included. Jake Gyllenhaal, for those of you who have seen or read October Sky, it's a great movie, great piece of literature. Maybe if you've seen on Twitter the GIF of our Earth size compared to our sun, compared to other supergiants, people are like, whoa, this is so cool. Like, that really makes me put my life into perspective, but then they don't really do anything for it. Well, for my aerospace engineering study, I've kind of taken all my interests and tried to make a real-world purpose for them. So hello, my name is Kaeli Long. I am an ISM 2 student this year, and this year I've chosen to study aerospace engineering. As you can see, I've also included pictures of the Saturn V, which was the rocket responsible for our Apollo program, so putting the man on the moon, you know, Neil Armstrong, things like that. And also I've included a picture of a black hole because that's just something that's really interesting to me, space, the final frontier, all that fun stuff. As part of our ISM program, we're asked to select a quote that we think represents who we are or our ISM journey, something that'll keep us motivated. So for my quote this year, I've chosen something from Maya Angelou. She says, my mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style. So we as ISM students, obviously, we try to do the best we can, put our best foot forward, experience something that most high school students won't ever experience in their time in high school. And we've been granted this opportunity to really explore something that we might want to pursue in our future. And I think Maya Angelou said it best by saying, yeah, we want to survive and we want to thrive, but we also want to be ourselves while we're doing it. As a part of the first semester of our ISM program, we conduct informational interviews with professionals in our field of study. For me, the interview process has always been something that I look forward to, just because you're really gaining firsthand experience and insight into your field. I've included a few of my informational interviews that have directly influenced my original work that I will get into later. But I first wanted to talk about my interview with Miss Monica Merritt. So I was actually given her contact information last year, so she's been someone I've had my eye on. And she's an aerospace engineer with the FAA, which is a government corporation basically for aerospace engineers. And really my interview with her was something unlike what I've experienced the last 2 years of ISM. We actually met over lunch, which is kind of intimidating sometimes because you don't know if I'm supposed to talk or eat or like how to work that all in, but it was really comfortable and it really worked. But the thing that stood out to me was when she explained how she became interested in aerospace engineering. So she actually grew up in Hawaii with her family, and early in the morning her dad and her would go to the beach and they would collect these things called glass bubbles, and they would float over from the Philippines. But what the glass bubbles are is that it's hydrogen and carbon kind of condensed together, and then they'd float over to Hawaii, and it's just created something beautiful. And that was something that she just really loved to collect with her dad. But after they would have their little hunt for those glass bubbles, they would lie down on the beach and watch as planes would take off on the tarmac. And that's really what sparked her interest in planes and in the aerospace field. Currently, she's working on projects related to different fuel sources for planes as they're changing the engines for smaller piston planes. And really, we see with our environment and things like that, fuel efficiency is something that we really need to consider. But this was really one of my favorite interviews that I've had over the last 2 years. Another interview that I had was with Mr. John Harkins, and he's actually a retired aerospace engineer, but he worked for the International Space Station. So he wasn't actually on the International Space Station, but he was a principals engineer, meaning that he dealt with different components like with circuits and with communication systems and things like that. He's currently a career coach, and he's actually a very, I feel like he's a competitive spirit, and he likes to recruit as many people as he can into the aerospace field just because it's something he loves. And really, he's trying to find women our age that are interested in the field just so we can get a leg up in the field. It was it was an awesome experience to meet with him, mainly because he's had such an experience in the field, and also because I was able to meet with him twice. So as many as you know, we have our business symposium at the beginning of the year, and that's actually where I met Mr. Harkins. Well, as our ISM 2 students, we stand off while the ISM 1 students start filling up the interview spaces so that they can have that experience. He was the last one left in the library, and I was chosen to go meet with him, and it just so happened that he was an aerospace engineer. So we talked about strengths and weaknesses and maybe some faults in the aerospace industry, and that meeting really influenced me to want to meet with him again for another interview. And my last interview that I want to talk about is with Mr. Matt Spradley. So going into ISM, I knew I wanted to do engineering, and I knew it was aerospace engineering, but I wanted to keep my options open and maybe explore some of the other disciples. So I met with Mr. Spradley, who has experience in electrical engineering and also in coding. At first, this was really me trying to gain information into all different types of engineering rather than specifically learning about coding. But it so happened that this interview would directly affect my original work. But meeting with him, we talked about the importance of computer science and coding in aerospace. So you'll see there's a lot of crossover in all types of engineering between different math disciplines and engineering and physics and all those types of subjects. He also explained that it's important to have internships, which a lot of the interviews I went on have told me, and really getting your foot in the door of the industry since aerospace engineering is very competitive. The next part that I wanted to discuss was my research. So in ISM, we also conduct research into our field aside from our interviews, just so we can really focus on the independent part of our study. Part of my research, I spent researching the International Space Station, which I talked about earlier with Mr. Harkins. But basically, the International Space Station, as I have explained to a few of the kids who came to my display last week, is that it's basically a giant house for astronauts to live in. And they conduct research, they live there, they do different projects, and it's really a great place to gain information about our solar system, about our universe, and things like that. The thing about the International Space Station is that it's expected to be sold in 2020, maybe to a private corporation, and so they're planning to launch new space stations within the next few years, which is really exciting for our aerospace industry. Also, NASA's preparing for a manned Mars mission if we can somehow fudge that. The thing with Mars is people, I know SpaceX specifically, they're trying to eventually have the end goal of living on Mars, but with our atmosphere and things like that, it looks like if we were to ever go to Mars, we'd have to live underground. So NASA's preparing this mission and has been using research from people on the International Space Station to really make this a possibility for us. Another part of my research was about the Hubble Space Telescope. This was built in 1990 and sent up in 1990, and it is what's called a Cassegrain reflector. So in my research, I learned about different telescopes, different satellites, different antennas, all with fancy words and meanings. But basically, this means that it has a double mirror reflection, so it'll see the image and then reflect it again for our images or our viewing purposes. I was drawn to research about this because we know a lot of things are just kind of floating up around our Earth, but we're not sure what. And with the Hubble Space Telescope, that's more for deep space exploration and things like that, and it gives us a better view of the things happening outside of our Earth and our fun little community we have. It's an interesting thing about this also is the research component. So there's a lot of competition for time with this piece of equipment. So people will send in proposals and say, hey, this is what I want to do with this telescope. And basically NASA and other government organizations will say, yeah, you're cleared for time with this telescope. But it's honestly a great piece of research or a great piece of equipment that we have used for research in the last few years. The last research assessment that I really want to talk about is data compression and communication. So we know that we send messages from Earth to space, to rockets, to the International Space Station, and all of that, but nobody really understands how we do that. So it's more than just texting your friend in the next room or something like that. You have to it's obviously sending messages, and you have to compress that data, but it's done through wavelengths and things like that. With data compression, it's used to communicate between satellites and antenna. So basically, as best as I can explain it, a signal is sent from, let's say, Earth, and goes to an antenna, which then takes in the information, bounces it back a couple of times, and then sends it to the next body that we're trying to communicate with. With data compression, though, it's much more serious than just compressing your message into the most basic thing you can. There's a lot of coding work that goes into that, which is really where I started to shift my focus from my original work that I will speak about in a second. For my original work, a lot of this was inspired from my 2 interviews with Mr. Harkins, the man who worked with the International Space Station. So in our interviews, we talked about maybe some of the setbacks we have in aerospace engineering, or maybe the really expensive components and things like that. And we talked about different satellites and antennas being so expensive and hard to repair while in space. So my inspiration really came from that interview for my original work. And what I decided to do for my original work was to take an antenna to be compressed and retracted in travel. So while it's maybe not in use, it can be protected from debris and things like that. The thing with satellites and antenna in space, some people use them interchangeably, but that's normally not the case. When I say antenna, people normally think like the antenna on your car, which is just like a bar and it kind of compresses sometimes. But antenna in space look much more like the satellite dish that's on your house. So that's where the confusion comes in, whether it's a satellite or if it's an antenna. Well, a satellite is considered anything that rotates or basically revolves around our Earth. So a chunk of metal in space around our Earth can be considered a satellite. So an antenna looks more like that satellite dish you would see on your house. So what I did for my original work, and this is an example of what the antenna looks like. It's actually called a rodar structure, which means it has that kind of bowl you'd see on top of your house, and then has a tripod maybe that you would see a camera connected to. And what happens is that the signal reaches the tip of the tripod. Well, it's actually caught in the satellite, or the main part of the antenna, which is the dish structure. It bounces up to the top of the tripod and back down to compress that data and to collect it for later use. So what I did was, rather than just having that circular structure, I designed for it to be separated into different panels, much like if you've ever been to an airport and you've seen the conveyor belt that your luggage comes out when you go to baggage claim, and the panels kind of overlap in little kind of chip structures. That's what I designed for this antenna, so that rather than it being one solid structure, it could kind of collapse in on itself like the opposite of a flower blooming. And by doing this, I would protect the very sensitive equipment that's inside of the antenna, and also protect from debris and speeds in the vacuum of space and things like that. Also, in designing my original work, I had to consider the different materials that would be used. So if you've ever seen a bulletproof vest, or seen maybe somebody going into action with a bulletproof vest on, that's made out of a substance called Kevlar, which is best described as, it's kind of like intertwined like tweed would be, but it's much more kind of plastic and more durable. So that would be the major component of building this antenna. And then also copper and aluminum for basic, more affordable elements. And then also for communication connections, those gold connections that wouldn't rust over time, just to keep up with everyday wear and tear. These are some of the sketches I included in my original work. I'm not an artist, so I apologize for that, but this is the basic design. So on the left, you can see the rodar structure with the tripod and the satellite of what, and the dish of the antenna of what a normal antenna would look like. And then on the right shows the more broken down kind of fan-looking structure that would allow it to collapse in on itself. Having completed my original work without the help of a mentor was kind of a time for me to look in on myself and see what I actually knew and apply my learning. And this has been one of the most rewarding experiences I think I've had throughout high school, just because it was a way for me to prove that I am learning something and that my passion is really coming to life. My goal for this year in ISM is really to gain knowledge and experience in aerospace while making great connections with people and being able to further that passion rather than being stuck in that rut of, oh, I need to complete my work, but being able to continue my legacy of loving space. The ISM program is something that has really allowed me to explore that interest, as I'm not taking aerospace engineering in other classes in high school, but I'm really able to dive deep and understand my passion on a new level. Thank you for attending my speech this evening. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.